advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
According to the FBI, there's one key difference between a serial killer and a spree killer. While serial killers have a cooling-off period between their crimes, spree killers typically continue to kill over a short period of time. Criminal psychologists and investigators have struggled to understand the psychology behind spree killers. But for many criminals, details about their childhoods can pull back the curtain, providing an insight into the horrific crimes they commit as adults. For Charles Starkweather, born in Nebraska in 1938, his resentment of other people was the motivator for his crimes, and it began to develop at a very young age. Charles was an unhappy child. He had a birth defect that affected the shape of his legs, and he claimed that his classmates bullied him because of his speech impediment. When he became a teenager, he fell in love with exercising, and now that he was strong enough, he turned the tables and started threatening and beating up his bullies. Quote, "He could be the kindest person you've ever met," said one of his school friends. "He'd do anything for you if he liked you. He was a hell of a lot of fun to be around, too. Everything was just one big joke to him. But he had this other side. He could be mean as hell, cruel. If he saw some poor guy in the street who was bigger than he was, better looking or better dressed, he'd try to take the poor bastard down to his size." Charles's classmates weren't the only people to notice that he had this dark side. By the time he reached his late teens, his family was so terrified of his fits of rage that they started avoiding him. In his senior year, in 1956, Charles dropped out of school and started working at a newspaper warehouse. At around this time, Charles was introduced to a girl who immediately stole his heart. Her name was Carol Ann Fugit, and she was only 13 years old. Charles was 18. Charles' job at the warehouse was close to where Carol went to school, so he started going to visit her after classes were finished. Because Carol was, again, only 13, she couldn't drive, and Charles decided that he would be the one to teach her how to drive. For Carol's driving lessons, he borrowed his dad's car, and she promptly crashed it, causing Charles to be kicked out of his home for good. Throughout his whole life, Charles had been a pessimist, always seeing the worst in people. Now, his worldview began to deteriorate. He started believing in nihilism, thinking that because life was meaningless, there was nothing to stop him from gaining power over other people at any cost. He even created his own motto to live his life by: "Dead people are all on the same level." And I think I understand what he means by that, but as far as life mottos are concerned, if you look past the dark nature of it, it's extremely unintelligent, something like a high school dropout would come up with. Charles put this new philosophy into action for the first time on November 30th, 1957. He was at a gas station trying to buy a stuffed animal, but the attendant wouldn't let him buy it on credit. The next night, he returned to the gas station to buy multiple other items, and he had a gun with him. He robbed the attendant for $100 cash. Then he forced that attendant into his car, drove to an isolated location where he fatally shot the man in the head. And if you're wondering why he was trying to buy a stuffed animal on credit, his girlfriend is 13 years old. The gas station killing wasn't the real beginning of Charles's killing spree. For him, it was just a warm-up. The spree began in January of 1958 when Charles drove to his now 14-year-old girlfriend's home. Carol's family, understandably, did not like their daughter's boyfriend, and they told Charles to go away. Beat it. In response, Charles drew his weapon and fatally shot Carol's mother and stepfather. Then he advanced on Carol's sister, 2-year-old Betty Jean. Instead of shooting the toddler, Charles beat her to death. This is where Charles and Carol's stories begin to differ. According to Charles, Carol had been there the whole time, arriving with him at the beginning of the night and watching as he killed her family. However, Carol insisted that she had arrived at the house later and found out that Charles was brandishing a weapon and holding her family hostage. He reportedly told her that if she didn't cooperate with him, he would kill her family. Whatever happened, Charles and Carol stayed at the house for the next 6 days until Carol's grandmother asked the police to go to the house and carry out a welfare check. By the time the officers arrived, Charles had hidden the bodies and the couple were long gone. 2 days later, Charles's brother and one of his friends also came to the house where they found the remains of Carol's family and called the police. Charles and Carol were officially wanted for murder. During their time on the run, the pair drove to the home of one of Charles's family's friends, 70-year-old August Meyer. Charles shot August in the head and then killed his dog. While they were fleeing the scene, Charles and Carol's vehicle got stuck in the mud, forcing them to abandon it and hitch a ride. They were picked up by 2 teenagers, Carol King and Robert Jensen. As soon as Charles and Carol were in the car, Charles pulled out his gun and forced Robert to drive them to an unused storm shelter. Once they were there, Charles fatally shot Robert. He then tried to sexually assault Carol, but when he failed, he shot her out of anger. However, he claimed that his girlfriend Carol had actually been the one to shoot her. Carol later claimed that she had remained in Robert's car the entire time and had not seen what took place in the storm shelter. The couple then drove to a wealthy area of Lincoln, Nebraska, where they broke into the home of a wealthy businessman named Chester Ward. Charles killed Chester and his wife Clara when they returned to the house. To prevent the family dog from barking at them, he killed the dog with his bare hands. Clara was the first person to arrive home and was stabbed to death. When Chester arrived home later, he was fatally shot. Leaving all members of the household dead, Charles and Carol stole the luxury car parked outside, taking some of the couple's jewelry with them as they drove out of Nebraska. Investigators suspected that Charles and Carol were behind these murders, but despite multiple sightings, they were unable to find and apprehend them. Meanwhile, after arriving in Wyoming, Charles and Carol knew that they needed to swap out their stolen car, so they shot a traveling salesman who was sleeping in a parked car and stole his vehicle. However, this new car was equipped with a parking brake, something that Charles had never had experience with. He never released the brake, causing the car to stall. When a motorist pulled over to help, Charles threatened the man with his gun. A sheriff's deputy came to investigate the commotion shortly afterwards, and Carol ran over to him saying, "It's Starkweather. He's going to kill me." Charles fled from the scene, but was captured by the police after being chased down by 3 police officers in a high-speed car chase. Carol, who had remained with the sheriff, had already been arrested. Throughout her interrogations and during her trial, Carol always insisted that Charles held her hostage, telling her that if she didn't do what he said, he'd kill her family. Over and over, she had promised she'd never killed anyone. Initially, Charles backed up Carol's story, saying that he'd kidnapped her and she had not participated in his crimes. Later, he changed his story enough that he ended up testifying against her in court, insisting that she had been a willing participant and calling her the most trigger-happy person he'd ever met. Charles was only tried for one murder, Robert Jensen, the teenage boy who had given him a lift, and he was found guilty in May of 1958 and sentenced to death by electric chair, which took place the following year. Reportedly, Charles was never concerned about the sentence or afraid of death, but insisted that if he was going to be killed for his crimes, Carol should die too. He never spoke any official last words, but instead, his last words were in a letter he wrote to his family, which read, quote, "But Dad, I'm not real sorry for what I did, 'cause for the first time, me and Carol have more fun." Despite Charles' insistence that his girlfriend should be executed as well, Carol was sentenced as an accomplice and sentenced to life in prison. After serving just over 17 years of her sentence, her application for parole was approved in 1976. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and I really appreciate you listening to the podcast. If you are new to listening to the podcast, welcome. Make sure before you go, if you're not on to binge the next one, even if you are right this minute while I'm talking, hit the subscribe button wherever you are listening. That's going to more easily help you catch up on all the back episodes, and when you log back into whatever listening app that you're using, you don't have to go and search for 10-Minute Murder each time if you're subscribed. And then if you like the podcast, make sure you share it with your friends and family. Just in casual, if there's someone that you know is into brief stories about true crime, let them know about 10-Minute Murder. If there's anything else you need to know about 10-Minute Murder, go to the website, 10minutemurder.com. All right, a quick email from one of you that listens. Hi, Joe. You never share emails from people that have negative things to say about 10-Minute Murder. Is there a reason for that? And by the way, I don't have anything bad to say. I love it and you. Amy in Minneapolis. Amy, thanks for the email, and here's the reason I don't usually do that. In the words of Mary J., the Queen, we don't need no hateration in this dancery. That's not verbatim, but you get it. I have read a couple of negative emails before, but they were respectful, so I read them back and replied. The ones that I don't even acknowledge are the bigots who like to spew hate anytime I mention a marginalized community. Without fail, I do a couple episodes involving the LGBT community close to each other and not space them out over several weeks. Someone will email me and tell me that the podcast is going to hell or something like that. If I mention during an episode that the police didn't handle something properly during an investigation, all of a sudden I'm a cop hater. So I get those, but I ignore them. If you're thinking about sending me a negative email, you can if you want to, but I wouldn't waste my time because it doesn't bother me. I don't really care. I know what I am and what I'm not. So let me be upfront about something. I have no idea how to make a podcast that everybody is going to like. I do know how to make a podcast that I will like. And by doing that, maybe you'll like it too. And based on the success that I've had, thanks to you listening, it's been overwhelmingly positive. I'm not perfect. I make mistakes, and I constantly tweak parts of the show to make it better or more listenable. But I'm basically making a show that I like, and I'm hoping that you do too. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening to another 10-Minute Murder podcast episode. I'll see you on the next one.